Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this snowy Friday for today's Lunch and Learn, Waste Watchers, a panel discussion with Don't Waste Maine. Landfill expansions, toxic leachate, out-of-state waste, oh my. Maine has become a dumping ground for the Northeast. But a coalition of community members and tribal citizens adversely affected by the negative impacts of landfill, incinerator, and waste disposal activities have banded together to keep tabs on all trashy things and to advocate for responsible policies to deal with our waste. Right now, the coalition, which is called Don't Waste Maine, is focused intently on LD 1639, which would close the out-of-state waste loophole. That's also a priority of Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. Dana Colihan is the Maine State Director at Community Action Works and is here with us today to facilitate a panel discussion with members of the Don't Waste Maine Coalition. We have Bill Lippincott, who's the chair of Don't Waste Maine. We have Hillary Lister, Don Neptune Adams, who in addition to their work with Don't Waste Maine is a member of the Sunlight Media Collective and a member of the Penobscot Nation. And we also have Sara Nichols, who is NRCM's Sustainable Maine Program Director. Welcome to all of you. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. Dana will facilitate a great panel discussion with all of our speakers, and then we'll turn it over to your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them and pose them for the panel at the end. If you do have any technical challenges, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you again for joining us. And Dana, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm super excited for this discussion. My name is Dana Colihan. I work at Community Action Works, and we believe that environmental threats are big, but the power of well-organized community groups is bigger, which is why we work side by side with everyday folks to, confront polluters and seed solutions. And today we're going to be really digging in on waste, and waste and waste management is something that we're all involved in and contribute to, whether or not we're aware of it. But not everybody is as deeply, kind of in these issues as the folks on the panel today. And so I wanted to start off this discussion with a question of what made you take this deep dive into this trashy world? And I am going to pass it over to Bill Lippincott to kick us off.
Hi. So I moved to Hamden in around 1998, and around that time, Casella was planning a major expansion of their landfill. And the more I found out about it, the less sense it made. And Dana, if I could have that first slide. It's surrounded on three sides by the South African Stream and its tributaries. It's located over an old gravel pit, which means that you've got sand and gravel, so that groundwater, the contaminated leachate, is going to go right from the groundwater into the stream or into the tributaries. There are residential houses all around the landfill. So I've hand colored this. This is from the DEP, it's from their application. So that orange is sand and gravel. And you see those arrows. This is a projected after the landfill was built. So this is what's going to happen after they've built their wonderful new, state-of-the-art landfill. And you can see the groundwater flow is going right into that blue stream, which is the Sawdabscook, which is only less than 2 miles, goes into the Penobscot River. And you can see there's a brook on the other side, flows into the Sawdabscook. That yellow in the top right is an aquifer. And as I say, you can see all those little red dots are houses. So this is not a place where you never should have had a landfill located here. And you should never have built a huge expansion over it. However, a group of us thought this was unwise. We appealed, DEP approved this landfill. We appealed to the BEP. We lost that first battle, but we continued to oppose it. In the meantime, we watched Casella's practices, and they had talked about this landfill lasting around 23 years. But within a few years, they were taking in so much more waste that by 2004, they said, oh, we're going to need another expansion. And one major reason for this was Casella also owned the Merck incinerator in Biddeford, and they were able to change the law so that they were allowed bypass from that Merck incinerator to come to the Hamden landfill. Well, bypass, the PERC has bypass, but maybe about 10,000 tons a year. All of a sudden, around 100,000 tons of bypass was coming in from that Merck incinerator to Hamden. And that's so it was filling up very fast. And you have to wonder, why was there so much bypass? Well, it appears that they were taking in way more than they could process at that plant. So this seems to be a pattern with Casella, and I'll talk about that later when we talk about Juniper Ridge. But when they went for new expansion, their practices did not work out well with DEP. And at the same time, we found major groundwater contamination. There was a fire that lasted over 3 days. It was probably burning internally for over 6 months. They were denied that expansion. And around that time, and I'll get into this later, about Juniper Ridge, Casella was able to shift their operating the state-owned landfill. So that's kind of the history. A couple of things. We just learned about PFAS contamination. It's over 100 times.
I'm gonna jump in and give you a quick pause because I feel like you're getting ahead of yourself. But thanks so much, Bill, for sharing a little bit. And we'll hear more about PFAS and all of that a little bit later. But thank you so much. Bill is also here with Hillary Lister from Don't Waste Maine. Hillary, do you want to share about how you took a deep dive into this work?
Sure, thank you, Dana. So I got involved in waste in the communities in 2002 following a fire at the biomass incinerator in Athens, where my grandfather is living. Athens is a small town in Somerset County on the West Aroostook Brook, which is tributary to the Kennebec. And there had been a biomass burner that was built in the 70s to burn waste wood from logging operations. Starting sometime in the late 90s, they modified their license to start taking in construction and demolition debris. And following the Twin Towers collapse in New York City, all of a sudden the Athens facility was getting truckloads of hot construction demolition debris coming to that facility. The holding area for the construction demolition debris grew to be about 15 acres, and there was a fire in the fuel pile itself that included vinyl siding, plastics, treated wood, all sorts of unknown materials that were being trucked in. We didn't find out about the fire from the DEP or from the company. It was only from neighbors who were experiencing pretty heavy smoke, finding dead birds. Several people I know ended up having to go into the hospital at that time. finally, it turned out that the company had been importing construction demolition debris. They weren't actually in violation of any of their licensing requirements, but they did end up shutting down, also realizing that the burner wasn't really built for burning the SIR debris. There was a plan for a new incinerator to replace that, and I got involved with a group in town, Citizens Against Pollution in Town, that we had a 3-year fight to stop the new incinerator from being built. In the meantime, the state of Maine made a deal supposedly to save jobs at the Georgia Pacific Mill in Old Town that involved the state taking over the mill's landfill and also the state purchasing the Athens incinerator, moving it up to the mill site to burn construction demolition debris, with the plan for the ash from that to go into the landfill. Like I said, the burner was never built for burning plastics or other debris like this, so they had a number of problems, including a lead-filled cloud of soot that ended up raining on neighboring communities in 2006 or 2008. That eventually shut down, but it put me in touch with people who were organizing around Old Town, Penobscot Nation, and dealing with the state landfill. And since then have connected with other communities like Norwich Walk and Heartland. They're dealing with similar expansions of waste facilities that are becoming sort of the basis of the economy in some of these towns and creating a lot of health threats that aren't necessarily being addressed. So.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Don, do you want to go? You're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I had to change location. My roommate needed the room I needed. Hello, everyone. I am Dawn Neptune Adams. I'm an environmental activist, a member of Sunlight Media Collective, and a granddaughter of the Penobscot Nation. I got involved with Juniper Ridge landfill and waste policy. I think 2013, 2014. And I got involved because, well, the Penobscot people have been protecting the land, water, and all our relations, and especially the Penobscot River, for countless generations here. And I was horrified to learn about what was being put into the river, and the leachate especially. The Juniper Ridge landfill is just slightly upriver from the Penobscot Nation, Indian Island. And the leachate from the Juniper Ridge landfill is processed at an old, decrepit wastewater treatment plant at the paper mill, just downriver from the Penobscot Nation. We're literally surrounded by poison from this landfill. JRL is a major contributor to the chemicals that are currently being found in the river. Their processing to this point has been mostly just diluting and then dumping in the river. So that is how I got involved. I've watched as community members, experts who know far more than I do, who are on this panel, have written policy that should have been enacted in LD 401. I saw it, barreled over by the industry and state collusion that happened. I saw it changed into meaninglessness. Originally, that was meant to, first of all, provide third-party verification of what the waste industry was telling us they were doing. It was meant to stop out-of-waste state from coming into JRL, which was only meant for the state of Maine. And it was supposed to provide a way that recycling was actually recycling and not just out-of-state waste brought in, used as cover, and called recycling.
Thanks.
We have been working on LD 1639, which is part of that in limiting the out-of-state waste that comes in. And that is where we continue.
Thanks so much, Dawn. And last but not least, Sara Nichols.
Great. Thank you, Dana, and thank you, everybody. Thanks to MCV for hosting this panel today, and thanks for being here. So I'm Sara Nichols. I'm the Sustainable Maine Director for the Natural Resources Council of Maine. I've been with NRCM for 8 years, and my job there is to I work on waste policy. So I'm either keeping bad things from happening or trying to pass more policies. And this is actually a perfect job for me. I started my undergraduate degree is in environmental resource economics, and I studied environmental policy and science for my master's degree. And my first job out of grad school was helping towns in New Hampshire increase recycling. So I was helping towns pass local policies that got them curbside recycling contracts or pay-as-you-throw programs. And it really, all politics are local. It really dawned on me what it took to get, it does take people power and people organizing to, educate lawmakers to make better decisions. And a lot of these, I brought up the economics because a lot of our waste issues they're all economics driven. A lot of the reason why we have so much waste disposal and not enough waste reduction is because of cost. It's cheap and easy to make a lot of waste. Anyway, so that's, I'm super interested in this. I'm happy to, I hope you guys have lots of questions, and I want to talk a lot about LD 1639, an effort to close the out-of-state waste loophole. So thank you.
Thanks so much. So, our first question to dive into this a little bit more, but what is the problem with how waste is managed in general, or what is the problem with how waste is managed in Maine? And Sara, I think you're still unmuted, so I'm not sure if you want to take it, and then you can pass it to Hillary.
Sure. Yeah. And I touched on that just a little bit. I think basically we have a lot of room for improvement in Maine. I think one of the issues that we have in Maine right now is our data. We can't really manage what we can't measure. We don't have a good solid grasp on, say our state recycling rate is reported to be 36%. That's kind of a best guess. And that's just what's collected for recycling, not what's actually recycled. So that's an issue. I think that, like I said, the price, often disposal is the path of least resistance. And we really need, I'm a huge proponent of policy in general. But we need policies in place to make it so that that's the least attractive option. I think often who pays for disposal and for doing there's a lot of, another economics word, externalized costs on taxpayers, property taxpayers, or state of Maine taxpayers often are left cleaning up messes that they did not make. And we're big fans at NRCM of having the the polluter pays principle, and putting those incentives in the right place for that. And I think another issue, another umbrella issue is that we're making too much waste to begin with. There's not enough focus on waste reduction or designing all of the materials that we use to be reused or recycled. And we're making some headway in Maine with that. But I'll leave it there and let Hillary fill in what I missed.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sara. And I think the key piece you brought up was the economics of this, and it's extremely profitable to incinerate and landfill waste right now. And the incentives are in place that encourage this, where they're not in place to encourage recycling facilities, real recycling, source separation, especially since there's been so much consolidation of the waste industry itself, where over the past 2 decades, you really only have a couple companies that control most of the collection, trucking, recycling, sorting, dumping, burning, every aspect of the handling the materials. And it is more profitable for them under the current structure to send this to a landfill, especially from states that have passed more restrictive requirements on what can and can't go in a landfill. And a number of states and provinces in the Northeast have passed recycling mandates, which is ideal, except for the fact that it is still, with Maine's policies, it is cheaper to truck that waste from those states which would otherwise require recycling to a state where it's totally legal to put this in a landfill. And finally, there's renewable energy credits for any power generated by incineration of construction demolition debris, and also gas produced from landfill methane gas generation. This, again, other Northeast states do not provide Class 1 renewable energy credits the way Maine does, but the very consolidated industry is a very powerful presence in the legislature, and they've been able to lobby for these sort of incentives that have made it extremely profitable to dump in Maine as opposed to reducing and recycling waste at its source.
Yeah, there's a lot of different issues there. Oh gosh. And like what, I know we've been talking about Juniper Ridge landfill, which is this like landfill that's owned by the state. Bill, I was wondering if you could like kind of dig in a little bit more there on like, what are the problems with this particular landfill?
Yeah, so we have a very strange hybrid. It's a state-owned landfill, but it's run by a commercial operator. So we have a state hierarchy that makes landfilling at the bottom of that hierarchy. That's the last place that you want to see waste. But you have a commercial operator that has an incentive to bring in as much waste as they can. And you have an arrangement in this case. Casella used to own this waste processing facility in Lewiston. It's now owned by Re-Energy, but the same agreement contracts were kept in place. Now, Re-Energy, it's called Resource now. Most of the waste that they process comes from out of state, mostly from Massachusetts. It's processed in Lewiston. 90% of it winds up at Juniper Ridge. This was because of lobbying interests that changed the law so that all of a sudden waste that was processed in Maine becomes Maine waste. That's the loophole we want to change with LD 1639. But it comes to Re-Energy, 90% goes to Juniper Ridge. About half of that is alternative daily cover. It's used as the cover for the landfill. I think we can talk a little later about all the problems with that, but they're counting that as recycling. And it's a sham. So those are some of the issues, and I'll pass the baton on to Dawn to talk some more about this.
Oh, Dawn, you're on mute.
Protecting the water and protecting the watershed of the Penobscot area, the Penobscot River area, is of the utmost importance, not just for the Penobscot people, but for all. Many people depend on hunting and gathering to sustain them, and that will become even more important as inflation becomes untenable and food prices rise. We protect the Penobscot River not just for ourselves, but for everyone, and also for future generations. The future of the watershed of the Penobscot River will be in dire straits if Casella is allowed to continue the way it has been. Casella touts the landfill liner as state of the art and protective and a way that they are mitigating pollution in the Penobscot River. But even the most state of the art landfill liners only last for about 70 years, and the kind that Casella is using is only good for about 25 years. So we're essentially allowing them to pollute in the future. We're allowing them to pollute our children and our grandchildren and their water, and that is unacceptable. That is one of the major concerns. Deer have been tested positive for Pfas, and many of us depend on hunting and wild game to feed our families. And of course, the fish. The Penobscot Nation has treaty reserved sustenance fishing rights which are useless if we can't eat the fish. And at this point, the Penobscot Nation Natural Resources Department recommends that women who are pregnant, nursing, should not eat any fish out of the river, and children under 8 should not eat any fish out of the river. Otherwise, you can eat about 10 ounces a month, which is, according to Natural Resources Director John Banks, retired, unfortunately for us, that is about a half of a deck of playing cards. That's a piece of fish about this big per month. And we are very concerned that that is not sustenance, not at all. This is also a case of environmental racism.
Yeah.
I know Hillary Lister mentioned at one time that companies like Casella will go through, records of and find places where the people who should be concerned about their areas being polluted don't have the monetary way of fighting back against these kind of concerns. And that is exactly what has happened here.
Thanks so much for sharing, Dawn. And yeah, exactly what you're saying. This is like an issue of environmental racism, environmental injustice, the way that, waste facilities are often like intentionally cited in, communities that they believe like won't be able to like fight back. And Hillary, I know you've done a lot of thinking on this as well. Is there like anything else that you want to add?
Sure. Yeah. So, Dawn really covered a lot of that really well. And one of the things, so I had gone to an EPA summit on environmental justice that included a person who had worked for the waste industry previously in citing landfills and incinerators. And they laid out the metrics that they look at when citing these. One of the other things they look at first is the college completion level, since they figure in a community where people don't have those degrees, you're not going to have attorneys, you're not going to have the resources to challenge these things, and especially when the process to approve all these facilities is done very quietly behind the scenes using very technical language. But it's a continuation of injustice that's been happening on these rivers since the 1600s, when Maine became a resource colony for England and Europe. First, it was exporting logs for ships' masts. Then it was the damming of the rivers. Maine was been called a resource colony. The Nader book from the 70s called Maine the Paper Plantation. And it's really been the rivers and the land, the plants have been used by industry for generations now. And it's these communities, it's consistently mill towns, communities where facilities have been able to operate in ways that are poisoning the communities where they're located for generations, when it's no longer profitable to produce paper or leather or other products from the mill. Those mills still have very valuable licenses that the waste industry is interested in. So a lot of them have a license already for a landfill with the state landfill JRL. That was landfill site formerly operated by Fort James Paper as a paper mill sludge dump. You also have a lot of times incinerator licenses. And then the big thing is wastewater discharge licenses, since the mills are located on rivers. Under the Clean Water Act, they've been approved to discharge mill waste with very limited treatment, and now they're discharging landfill leachate, which contains a whole range of chemical compounds that are beyond the toxins even found in mill waste, and there's no additional treatment happening. And the same communities that have been targeted for generations are increasingly becoming the sites where these consolidated mega operations are growing, and it looks likely that the plan is to have them for an unknown number of more generations, because other places are not licensing new waste facilities, new landfills, or they're placing restrictions on what can be dumped into the rivers through the wastewater treatment facilities. Meanwhile, you have certain communities where the local government and economy has been so defined by the industries that really run the towns, that it's very difficult to challenge this or stop these from operating. But I think these discussions is part of just making this, which has been really invisible outside of the communities that are living with this, really making this visible so people see how this is directly coming right back into the rivers once the waste is disposed of.
Yeah, thanks for sharing more. It's so interconnected. And I think like the other thing that, comes up for me is, as we're continuing to discover the extent of PFAS contamination in the state, that's also being like super tied to, questions of like, now what are we going to do with this? And like, questions of waste management. And I just like wanted to, pass it over to Sara to talk a little bit more about this, and then also like continue the discussion of, the issues with Juniper Ridge.
Okay, sure. Well, let me just start by putting a finer point on the Juniper Ridge issue. That's something that really, I don't know, grinds my gears about this, is that this massive injustice that's happening up there never should have happened. So the state bought the landfill as a response to other states passing strict laws. And so they bought the landfill to prevent it from being filled with out-of-state waste. If it's a state-owned landfill, you can say what goes in there, and it was only meant to be for waste from in-state for the foreseeable future. And then as Bill was mentioning, the Casella and the resource facility basically are in cahoots to create this loophole to recategorize out-of-state waste as in-state waste by bringing it into a Maine solid waste processing facility and then dumping it up at Juniper Ridge. This is a very lucrative setup that they have made for themselves, and it's the volume at which this is happening that's the real problem. So about a third of the waste going into that landfill every year is waste from out of state, primarily construction demolition debris from Massachusetts, where they've banned that from happening. And so that's equivalent to 16 tractor trailer trucks, 40-ton tractor trailer trucks per day going to that landfill. It's an extreme amount of volume, and it's necessitated landfill expansions, and that the fill rate has just been exponential. It's due for another expansion in 6 years, and it's leading to all these problems that the communities, the people that live outside of this landfill have to deal with, and they've been totally underrepresented. And anyway, so I'm clearly fired up about this, but just putting a finer point on this massive injustice, and that should have never happened. And we're going to hopefully close the loophole with LD 1639. Now, just to bring up the PFAS issue. So there's an increase in PFAS contaminated sludge in Maine. There's more testing, which is great, but we're finding that there's more, farmland that cannot, in good conscience, be used to grow food any longer because there's been sludge spread on it. Any PFAS contaminated sludge should not be spread on Maine farmland, and is now increasing the amount of sludge that has to go to landfill. So again, this is Maine waste that should be, that goes to Juniper Ridge landfill. And Casella, the landfill operator, is exploiting this environmental disaster by saying that they need more out-of-state waste to bring it in to stabilize the sludge in the landfill. And that's just false. They do not need more out-of-state waste to do that. And they're using that issue as a reason to do so. So the issue with the PFAS sludge, we need to, number one, stop creating PFAS and putting it into our wastewater treatment plants. And there's ways to stabilize sludge in a landfill that don't require waste, dewatering and drying. So we could be investing in those options. And not only that, but we have plenty of in-state waste that can be used to stabilize the sludge outside of that. So we need to, so I'll stop there because I've been talking for a while, but that's the issue with the PFAS.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bill, is there anything else around PFAS that you want to hit on?
I'll just go back to Pine Tree for a minute. When I was reviewing my notes, I discovered, in addition to all this bypass, they were also taking a lot of sludge from Casella's Hawk Ridge facility, which they process sludge. And we finally got PFAS results for Pine Tree, and they're 100 times the state drinking water level. So that kind of explains that to me. And they're also very serious at Juniper Ridge. They're 20 times drinking water level. So you have PFAS coming from sludge, you have PFAS coming from It's called oversized bulky waste, which is a subset of what's being imported from Massachusetts. That's furniture, mattresses. It's sprayed with fire retardants. And then you have their cover, construction demolition debris, which has all kinds of chemicals in it. And that's getting into the leachate. And eventually that's getting into the groundwater. And that leachate right now is going untreated. This Pfas contaminated leachate, it is processed at the treatment plant, but not for Pfas because they don't have a treatment for Pfas. So all of that from Juniper Ridge is going into the Penobscot River.
Mhm.
And Dawn can attest, this is right below Penobscot Nation.
So I want to, have our last question before we move into, questions from the audience is we've heard so much about all the problems with the waste industry in Maine and, just in general, like what are the solutions that, we should be fighting for? And I think I'd love to hear briefly from everybody, but I'm not sure who wants to kick it off first. Maybe Hillary?
Sure. So I think there's a number of things that need to get done. Getting this legislation passed to close the loophole on allowing the construction and demolition debris to come from out of state and be counted as be used for stabilization or recycling in the state landfill. That's one key piece of it. But beyond that, stopping the incentives in the first place. Other states don't provide the renewable energy credits for landfill gas or incineration. Or in some cases, if the facility is located in what they have determined to be an environmental justice community, an overburdened community, then the company can't receive those incentives. And the other thing is really trying to get back to smaller, localized recycling, real pre-sort recycling as opposed to single stream recycling, which is something that's really been taken advantage by the waste industry to take materials that could be more effectively sorted and recycled and end up with materials that are increasingly landfilled. And then just getting people educated on where the waste is going, how this is happening, and trying to take the action in local communities to keep that waste from poisoning other communities.
Thanks so much. Don?
Well, I think that we really need to push Casella to be transparent and accountable. We also need to take a look at, what they're doing and how that they can pay restitution for all of this pollution that they've been causing. Joe Casella recently bragged in a meeting with shareholders that they reached almost $1 billion in revenue last year, and that they're on track to reach more than $1 billion in revenue in 2022. Perhaps some of that revenue could be spent on solutions such as, tarps, incinerators that can mitigate the Pfas at high heat, using any of the other technologies that are being developed to mitigate Pfas. Also, immediately, the leachate should be trucked to a better wastewater treatment plant than the one at Nine Dragons Paper Mill. Those are things right off the top of my head that I can think of.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Bill, any quick solutions?
Sure. Well, I mean, number one, let's get the legislature to pass LD 1639, so at least we can stop this flood of out-of-state waste going into our state-owned landfill. But also how we deal with our wasted resources. And we have a real crisis in my area. The MRC built this so-called state-of-the-art, it was going to be a recycling facility. And their idea was, you don't have to sort out the trash. We'll sort out recycling. We'll do it all. It has not worked. It's closed down. We need to go back to getting as much pre-sorted of our recyclable material, composting food waste, not mixing all this stuff together where it has the lowest value. So we need to address how we handle waste. And I think Sara can talk about EPR, which is now a law and it's in the process of being developed. Do you want to talk about that, Sara?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be a little bit big picture on the solutions I think we need to focus on, and I think that's a good example. So EPR is a law that just passed that shifts the costs of managing recycling or paying for recycling from taxpayers in Maine to the producers of packaging. So to the corporations like Amazon, Walmart, Procter & Gamble, all the companies who are creating the waste. So that's really internalizing those costs. We've been talking about economics all along the way. We're the first state in the nation to do this. I'm so proud of our state. And we need more of this kind of thing, because as a very close observer of state policy, I see all too often that corporations have too much influence over public policy. And I think that one of the biggest things we need to do is dampen that influence and the power that profit-seeking, polluting corporations have over our policies and our lawmakers. I think lawmakers in Maine are really highly attuned to these strategies that are happening. And I think that's why I've been able to make some progress here. And I'm honored that part of my job is being a watchdog at the State House to make sure these things. It's like whack-a-mole. There's bad things trying to be done all the time, and and all of getting the people of Maine to work together to fight for policies that are public policies should be focused on public benefit, not on the benefit of a couple of corporations and their profits. So I'll leave it there because I know we won't have time to answer questions.
Well, thank you all for digging in on these questions and sharing your expertise and lived experiences. And I will pass it over to Kathleen for the Q&A.
Thank you, Dana, and thanks to everybody. It really is just so heartening, and as discouraging as some of the news you shared was, it is so wonderful to see this coalition coming together. And we've got a ton of questions. Before we get into them, I do want to share with everybody a couple of resources and ways that you can continue being engaged from here. As we said at the top of the program, LD 1639, to close that out-of-state waste loophole, is a priority of Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. And so we're going to share this afternoon in the follow-up email, the fact sheet, the EPC fact sheet that walks through that bill. In that follow-up email, you will also find a link to Sunlight Media's video about Juniper Ridge landfill. You'll find links to the Don't Waste Maine Coalition website and Facebook page. You'll find ways to to reach out to your lawmakers directly to urge them to close the out-of-state waste loophole and conserve landfill space for actual in-state waste. And you'll also find a link to just an absolutely incredible set of resources and details that Sara and our friends at NRCM have pulled together. They've got a great resource page that has some videos and petitions and all sorts of background on this. So keep your eyes out for that very newsy and link-filled email this afternoon. And so we don't have to wait. What is the latest on 1639, and what should folks on this call today be ready to do to help move that bill forward?
Yes, I'll just take that one quickly. So the Environment Natural Resources Committee, they've had a public hearing, they've held a couple work sessions, and they ultimately voted overwhelmingly in favor of the legislation. It was 11-2. And currently it's in a procedural language review. Hopefully it'll come back to the committee sometime soon, maybe this week, maybe next. And then as soon as that happens, it'll get sent up to be voted in the Senate and then into the House. And right now, I would just encourage everybody to contact their lawmakers and ask them to support LD 1639. And in the email that Kathleen will send, it'll have all the talking points you might need, or if you want to read more up on it before you have those conversations, please do. There's a link to an NRCM action alert, so we can make it really easy for you to find your legislator and send them a message too.
Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate that. And Hillary, the details that you shared about the sort of approach that these waste companies take to identify vulnerable communities and go right there. I mean, this is our best bet, right? To show them that we are paying attention, we are standing together, and we are not going to tolerate this in any community in Maine. I am so curious about how Don't Waste Me came together. How did you all find each other, and how did the rest of us get involved?
So Don't Waste Me was originally sort of an informal mailing list that had started from following the Athens incinerator fight, connecting with folks dealing with the Casella landfill in Old Town. That really sort of became an informal coalition that about 3 years ago became formalized with forming an actual nonprofit organization to really try and provide resources for communities that are targeted with this, and also make it clear that this is an issue that affects everyone and take it out from behind the scenes, since that's what the waste industry is really counting on. If you can't see it, it's not affecting you. They just promise jobs, which aren't even really there to any degree. So also trying to show how the economics of this doesn't work and what alternatives we can really use, and things that are happening in other states and other communities that we could look at as models for here to really incentivize keeping materials out of the waste stream in the first place and providing markets for those materials. So those are all things we're looking at, but it's really.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, you got to this, and Sarah, you started with the economics of this. Is it really just the bottom line? It's so hard to really wrap our heads around not knowing. Like it doesn't seem true that you could just have not known that these practices were going to be dangerous. I don't know quite what to do with that.
Yeah, I know. It's just, we're going to keep having these waste problems and other environmental problems as long as there's big companies with that profit off of whatever the bad thing is and have deep pockets to keep the status quo. That's a common environmental thread, I think, amongst a bunch of issues. So until that's decoupled, and I think we're going to need policy to step in there and do that and provide better guardrails. We need stricter standards that force companies to do better. I think there's companies that do want to do better. We need to level the playing field with strong environmental regulations. I mean, it's for the best, the good of everybody. We want clean water and clean air for everybody, even Casella. I want them to have clean water and clean air as well.
Yes, thank you. And we're clearly not the only state. There are communities outside of Maine that are struggling with these issues, and sometimes with the very same companies, right? Are there networks of advocates working together in throughout New England and beyond, or are we able to share the people power that we're building here in Maine? How does that happen?
Yeah,
Dana, I see you nodding enthusiastically. It makes me so happy.
I mean, Community Action Works, we're an organization that's in the region, and I see people on this call that are fighting, Casella and New Hampshire and Vermont and these other states, and I think there is a lot of power in these groups coming together and saying, hey, these tactics that these companies are using to exploit us here are also being used there, and what has been effective for us will likely could also be effective for other folks to join together. And so there are informal and formal trash communities and calls to connect these groups and build solidarity. The more people we have fighting this stuff, the more powerful we'll be.
I'm going to take a minute to give a shout out to Conservation Law Foundation. Also, I noticed that Peter Blair is in listening to. They're a great organization too that works across the region, and they work on issues throughout these states too. So they're another good one to help us all work together.
And it does seem like so many of our options really do come down to, or our best path forward includes changing the laws. So thank you to CLF and everyone else who's working on that. As a consumer, as someone who throws things away, I can remember the advent of single sort recycling was going to be like, this is the thing that everybody will recycle. And Bill, what you were saying about, gosh, we don't even have to separate out our compost, right? We don't have to think about this. It's going to just like magic. And Sara, you're shaking your head. That's turning out magic, I guess, not solving our problems here. What should we be looking for if we're going to the transfer station or if we're standing over our recycling bins? What should we be doing at home in terms of sorting or composting? Like, how do we know if we're doing the right thing?
I'll jump in quickly with my 2 cents on that. There's a lot. First, I'm here to tell you it's not your fault. Things should be designed with reuse and recycling, waste reduction in mind from the outset. So it's okay. It's also confusing to tell people what to do because each town might do something different. So with the EPR law that's passed, it'll help get more uniformity amongst recycling programs several years from now. But in the meantime, you have to check to see what your town accepts. And it might be kind of sad because they might not accept for recycling some of the stuff that you think is recyclable or wish was recyclable. So the most important thing to do is to make sure you're putting the right things in the bin and not doing this thing called wish cycling, which might ultimately end up contaminating this waste stream or the recycling that's coming out, and that just brings down the quality and the price that you might get for it. One quickly, so our bottle bill in Maine is one of our most successful recycling programs because you get a really high return rate, and it's a really way to get a nice clean quality material. So that also makes the case, when you have this separated clean material that fetches a higher value, single stream doesn't really get at that as well. Some facilities do better than others, and EcoMaine does do a good job trying to educate people, trying to get them not to do that wish cycling and reduce the contamination. And they're, they have a relatively small residue rate, but other single stream facilities have a higher one. So it really depends. I usually give recommendations to towns. If you have one of those transfer stations where there's different bunkers for each thing, keep it like that, even though it might be tempting to do single stream. But if you have a curbside pickup program, single streams, it's probably more cost effective and a good way to get stuff out of the waste stream.
I'm just going to jump in. For people in MRC communities, almost all of the stuff is not getting recycled right now because that plant is down. It's getting landfilled or it's getting incinerated. There's some towns that are starting up their recycling programs again. And I think right now, I hope all of those towns start up the recycling programs again. But we have a real crisis for any town that signed on to this fiberite plant. And we're looking to try to not go back to that system. They're looking for new investors for the same, to my mind, failed system. And as Sara said, the best way is to get as much as you can out of the waste system before it gets collected, not mix it all together with the waste.
I'd just say on the really local level, getting involved with town politics to see what their plans are and if it's possible to either re-implement pre-sort recycling, since a lot of towns now are getting good revenue from selling clean recyclables that they had been sitting on for a while, and also keeping an eye out to make sure the town doesn't get locked into a contract where they're effectively prevented from running their own recycling, which has been an issue in a number of towns, either agreements with incinerators or other sorts of facilities that by signing on to that, the town itself is no longer able to effectively run a profitable recycling program. So
it really does feel like it shouldn't be this complicated, but thank you for helping us start to figure it out. And Dana, thanks for putting in that that link to MRC. Tell us again, Bill, you just mentioned it. What is MRC and how do I know if I'm in an MRC community?
Well, it's Municipal Review Committee. They have a website, and they have occasional meetings that are open to the public. So you can find out when those meetings are on their website. I encourage people to attend those meetings and speak about what kind of recycling you would like to see, as opposed to continuing or trying to revive this way that, to my mind, is not really recycling at all. So yeah, it's Municipal Review Committee. They do have a website and they do have board meetings and open to the public. I urge people to attend and speak their mind.
Thank you. Thank you. And there were a couple of other terms that folks asked about. Pre-sort recycling, that's just sorting out our glass from our cans, from our plastic, and okay. Is there, and Sara, I should know this, so I apologize, on the NRCM resource page, do you all have a list, a glossary of terms, or Dana, is that something you can point us to?
We should make
No, but that's a good idea. Yeah,
a
yeah, we
lot
can
of
make one.
confusing lingo.
Okay, so if that's an assignment to all of us, right? If we come across a term that we don't recognize, I can guarantee you, you're not the only one. Let's send Sara and Dana a quick note and say, help, we don't know what that means. Oh my goodness, I just looked at the clock. I have a whole long list of other questions. So we're gonna have lots of reasons to reach out to you. Let's see, what's a good, how do we know where there's a market for recyclables and where there's not? And is there anything we can do? Like I said, I'm going to just end with a real quick, easy question. How can we help build the market for recycled materials? I knew you'd know, Sara. Everybody, I'm showing you my cards. I lean on Sara and Dana for everything that comes to solid waste talk.
Well, one type of policy that's bubbling up throughout the United States is their minimum recycled content standards. We're very close to getting a bill off the appropriations table here in Maine. It's LD 1467. It requires a minimum recycled content requirement for plastic beverage containers. And yes, they're plastic. But if we want recycling to work, there has to be a demand for the material. So if we tell these beverage companies you have to have this material, they're going to invest in those facilities, and it's going to support things like our bottle bill. Like that stuff has to have a place to go to get turned into new bottles, and it reduces the demand for more virgin materials. So which saves on greenhouse gas emissions and other costs too. So we're seeing, that's only for plastic beverage containers, but we're seeing a lot more of those pop up for other types of materials too. Some other policies I've seen are pushing for more responsible recycling markets and also trying to track where things are actually getting recycled. So part of the EPR law, we're going to start being able to track what's collected for recycling and then get an idea about where that is going. And Oregon passed a similar law, and they're actually required to send them to responsible end markets. So it can't go, say, overseas somewhere where it might go to a mismanaged landfill and end up at the ocean, for instance. So we need more policies around things like that too.
Thank you. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, Dawn. I am so grateful to all of you and to the whole Don't Waste Me coalition. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. It seems like we just need to stick together and learn from each other and keep working together. You will see a whole bunch of ways to follow up on today's program in the follow-up email this afternoon. I also hope you will join us again next week. We're going to keep on the theme of environmental justice, particularly for Maine's tribal nations. Next week's program is about securing clean drinking water for Passamaquoddy tribal members. The current municipal water supply for Passamaquoddy, Pleasant Point Reservation, and for the city of Eastport is delivered by a state-regulated utility, the Passamaquoddy Water District. You might think that means that when you turn on the tap, you can trust what comes out, but it is not the case for those folks. That water is often discolored, odorous, tainted with high levels of carcinogens. I'm warning you now that this is going to be a very upsetting program at the top, and really encouraging because LD 906 is currently working its way through the legislature as a really incredible opportunity to ensure clean drinking water for Passamaquoddy tribal members. We'll have tribal representative Rena Newell and Corey Hinton, who is an attorney and leader of Drummond Woodsum's Tribal Nations Practice Group, with us next week. I hope you will all be with us as well. In the meantime, I hope you have a beautiful snowy day, and grateful to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to see you all. Thanks for coming.